Let's continue our discussion of Chapter 4. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about something called pedigree analysis. So we're going to take this idea of single gene traits and we're going to translate it to inheritance disorders. So we're going to take a look at autosomal dominant inheritance, that's a pattern of inheritance, and also autosomal recessive inheritance as a pattern of inheritance. And again, we're going to spend most of our time specifically looking at genetic disorders and conditions relating to those two patterns of inheritance. And then we'll also look at how we can track these particular disorders through generations through the use of something called a pedigree. So when it comes to diseases in humans, most diseases that we encounter, again, are not as simple as a single gene inheritance. So if you think of things like cancer and heart disease and diabetes and a whole host of other diseases, those diseases are very complicated and they absolutely do include some genetics and inheritance, but they also include a lot of different types of environmental and lifestyle conditions as well. For the disorders that we're going to talk about in this particular lecture, we're looking at a unique group of conditions. And these particular conditions are caused by, again, a single gene and a mutation that has occurred in those genes, which is now causing a condition or a disorder. So if we're looking at diseases that are caused by single gene disorders, the vast majority of them are going to be recessive conditions. So these are conditions where you have two parents who don't have this particular disorder, and then they have an offspring who does. So that's how we know it's recessive, and we'll talk about that pattern of inheritance. But the best example I can give is cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis is a recessive genetic condition, and you just need those two recessive alleles in order to have that trait. There are some dominant genetic disorders, single gene dominant genetic disorders, but there aren't very many of them. The best one is probably known as Huntington's disease, and it is one of those diseases. Remember how we were talking about in proteins, how you can have misfolded proteins that can accumulate as plaques in the brain, and they cause a whole host of conditions. We talked about Parkinson's and we talked about Alzheimer's. Huntington is kind of something very similar to that, where you have basically this accumulation of plaques in the brain over time. It's dominant though, so you would have to have a parent who had the condition in order to have the condition yourself. So we're going to look at what's called a mode of inheritance. And a mode of inheritance are the rules that explain these pattern of inherited traits as we follow it through families. So it's either, again, a recessive mode of inheritance or a dominant mode of inheritance. And the important distinction is that in the case of a dominant mode of inheritance, the parents have to have the trait in order to pass it on to the offspring. It can't just spontaneously happen. Whereas in a recessive trait, in a recessive mode of inheritance, you could have a trait that hasn't been seen in generations, and it all of a sudden appears in a child because you need two copies of that allele, and your parents just had one copy, and so it had no effect on you. So when we're talking about modes of inheritance, the other important distinction to make is also whether it's on a sex chromosome or it's on an autosome. So we have autosomal traits, which is what we're going to talk about in this lecture. And then there are also sex-linked traits, which are on our sex chromosomes, our X's and our Y's. We're not going to talk about those in this lecture. We're going to talk about those in a future lecture, though. And again, the other thing is whether the trait is a dominant trait or a recessive trait. So with these two things in mind, let's start with autosomal dominant inheritance patterns. So this is where you have a trait that's caused by a dominant allele. And it doesn't matter whether you're homozygous or whether you're heterozygous. If you have at least one copy of the allele, you're going to have this trait. Because it's an autosomal trait, it can appear in either sex. It doesn't matter if you're male or female, because those autosomes, those 22 pairs of autosomes, we all have. And again, the big key here is that one of the parents has to have the trait to pass it on to their offspring. So this is something that you would know that is in your family because your parent had it, and their parent had it, and their parent before them. So that's how this mode of inheritance works. And we know that with this particular pattern of inheritance, each child has a 50% chance of receiving this trait or disorder. And again, that's based on the assumption that your parent is heterozygous for the trait. It would be very unusual for your parent to be homozygous for that trait, because that means both of their parents also had the trait as well. So typically we're going on the fact that your parent has one allele for this trait. So let's take an affected parent who has, let's say it's Huntington, and they produce two gametes. They produce the gamete for the trait, in this case this disorder, the capital A, and then their other little a is an unaffected heterozygote. And then you have a parent, so in this case this is the mom, and then you have a parent, the dad in this case, who doesn't have the trait at all. So once again, using our Punnett squares that we worked on in our previous lecture, we find that there's an exactly 50% chance that the offspring would have this particular trait. So some examples of autosomal dominant disorders, a type of dwarfism that's called achondroplasia. So this is where you have individuals who have a normal size head and a normal size trunk, but they have short limbs, so short arms and short legs. And then we also see polydactyly, so having extra digits, extra fingers or extra toes. This is a dominant trait as well, so in addition to the Huntington's trait disease that we saw previously. So Huntington's disease, again, I mention it because it's a dominant condition, and unlike achondroplasia or polydactyly, this happens to be a fatal condition. So this is something that leads to a shortened lifespan. And these abnormal proteins that clump up specifically in nerve cells in the brain eventually cause a whole host of problems. So again, what's interesting about Huntington's is the actual symptoms don't begin to appear until about midlife. So before the age of genetic testing, it was difficult to determine whether or not someone had this condition before they had kids, because they possibly wouldn't know, depending on if they knew much about their parents, they wouldn't know if they had it until symptoms onset, and that would be, again, usually 40s to 50s. By that time, most people have already had children, so they possibly already passed it on at that point. So that's why, again, before the age of genetic testing, where we can now test people, and we routinely test people for these types of conditions, it was something that got spread a lot more frequently. So let's move on to our next mode of inheritance, and this is autosomal recessive inheritance. The vast majority of genetic defects and diseases are caused by recessive alleles on autosomes. So this is by far the more common mode of inheritance for genetic traits and conditions in families. In order for these traits to occur, each parent has to carry an affected allele. Okay, we call these parents carriers for a trait. To be a carrier means you're carrying that recessive allele around, but it's not doing anything, right? It's being masked by the dominant trait. So you might not even know that it's there until you happen to have a child with someone who also has that recessive allele, and one of your offspring has that trait. So in this case, let's just look at hair type. So curly hair is dominant, straight hair is recessive. So let's say we have two curly-haired parents, right? And they go on to have 4 children, and 3 of their kids have curly hair. And then out of nowhere, they have a kid who has straight hair. Well, that happened because, again, they were both carriers for that straight haired allele. And so it wasn't until they both came together that they actually produced a child who got one copy of that allele from each of her parents. In this case, there's only a 25% chance of a child inheriting this condition or this trait. So again, it's a 1 out of 4 chance. So the chances are much lower than we saw with those autosomal dominant traits. So a couple of autosomal recessive disorders, albinism, so a complete lack of any pigmentation in skin or irises or hair, that is a recessive trait. Cystic fibrosis is probably, again, one of the better known conditions. Basically, these individuals suffer from a whole host of lung infections and congestion and respiratory problems. They also suffer from digestive issues as well. So cystic fibrosis is not common, but it's not uncommon. It affects about 1 in 2,500 individuals in European populations. So that's where the allele sort of generated or came from, this mutation, I should say, started in European populations. And again, in order to receive, in order to get cystic fibrosis, you have to have 2 carrier parents. And the chance of being a carrier is about 1 in 300, again, for people with a European ancestry. Your chance of being a carrier for cystic fibrosis is about 1 in 300. What happens is cystic fibrosis produces a non-functioning protein, and that protein is responsible for transporting chloride ions in and out of cells in both your lungs and also other organs. So what it does is pulling in those chloride ions in and out of your cells produces this nice viscous thin mucus, and that mucus covers a lot of things. It covers the lining of your lungs, it covers the lining in your intestines, so that mucus is sort of an important feature of a lot of your internal organs. If you don't have that functioning transport, that protein transport, that chloride ion channel, what happens is you get this really thick layer of mucus, and the thick layer of mucus is very difficult to clear, and it's a breeding ground for bacteria, for infections. So people with cystic fibrosis have to be very, very careful about lung infections. It also makes it difficult to absorb nutrients in their intestines, once again, because that's part of where that mucus comes into play as well. So again, as a carrier, you have 1 allele, but it's okay because you have normal functioning protein channels for your chloride ions, so it's okay. However, if 2 carriers come together, you can potentially pass it on to your offspring. So let's take a look at a real quick example problem here. Let's say Paul and Marta have a child who was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, which is an autosomal recessive disease. If Paul and Marta have another child, what's the likelihood that their second child will also have cystic fibrosis? Is it 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, 2/3, or 3/4? And feel free to pause it if you need to draw your Punnett square here. It's actually a 1 out of 4 chance. Regardless of how many children they have, the chances will always be 1 out of 4 every single time. So it's always a 25% chance. It doesn't matter if they have 5 children who don't have cystic fibrosis or 5 children who do have cystic fibrosis. The chances are still going to be 1 out of 4. Another disease that we can talk about, a recessive condition here, is called sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is caused by hemoglobin that it does not take on this nice round shape, which is perfect for carrying oxygenated oxygen through the blood. Instead, in individuals with sickle cell anemia, they have this sickle shape to their red blood cells, and they are very poor oxygen carriers. So what's interesting about sickle cell anemia is if you have 2 normal hemoglobin alleles, you do not have the disease. If you have 2 sickle cell alleles, you will have sickle cell disease. And then once again, if you have 1 of each, you happen to be a carrier. So this would be a Punnett square that goes through, again, what happens if you have 2 individuals who are carriers for sickle cell. Same rules apply here. You have a 25% chance of having offspring who has sickle cell disease, and then a 50% chance of creating offspring who are carriers for sickle cell, and then a 25% chance of having an individual child who's completely unaffected. So speaking of families and conditions, let's talk about how we track genetic traits through families. And this doesn't have to be necessarily for a disease. You can use this for any trait at all. But we use something called a pedigree. And a pedigree is a handy way to look at connections between family members and how different traits are being passed on, and whether we can figure out whether those patterns fit into autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive or even sex-linked patterns. So there's a little bit of some terminology here and some symbols we use. Females are always circles, males are always squares. Individuals who don't have the condition are not filled in. Individuals who do have the condition are filled in, and individuals who are carriers for the condition are half filled in. And then there are other things like generations and parents and so on and so forth, but sort of these first group of symbols is kind of the most important here. So let's take a look at an example pedigree. And this pedigree is for an individual who is who has polydactyly. And if you remember, polydactyly is an autosomal dominant trait. So in this case, it will show up in every generation. So if you have it, then your parents had it. And if your parents had it, then their parents had it, and so on and so on and so forth. So let's take a look at, here's a family of siblings. And we have two men who have polydactyly, and then a woman who does not have polydactyly. So let's take a look at this branch of the family right here. So this man marries this woman, and they end up having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. Okay, of their 5 children, 1, 2, 3 have polydactyly, 1 of their sons and 2 of their daughters. They also have a daughter who doesn't have polydactyly and a son who doesn't have polydactyly. Okay, we can follow this branch then here where the son with polydactyly marries a woman. They have 1, 2, 3 children, 1 son with polydactyly and 2 children without. We can also follow this branch of the family here where we have a daughter who has polydactyly who marries a man and they have 2 children, a daughter who has polydactyly and a son does not. Okay, so again, this is a pedigree, and this shows us that there are no carriers here, right? You either have the trait or you don't, and it's in every generation. So we can see that this is a autosomal dominant pattern. Let's compare that to an autosomal recessive pattern of inheritance, and we're going to look at albinism as our example. So we're going to follow 2 families here. We're going to follow a family where we have a carrier woman and a carrier male in 2 separate families. Okay, so they marry and have offspring. They produce, again, a carrier daughter, and they produce a carrier son. The carrier son and the carrier daughter then produce 3 children, 2 of the children who have albinism and 1 child that does not. So in this case, what we see is 2 generations where there was no albinism whatsoever, right? No filled in circles or squares here, no filled in circles, squares here. We get down here to this 3rd generation, and now the trait is expressed. So we know that this is recessive because, again, we have this idea of carrier parents. All right, so let's do some genetic predictions here. So we've got Ellen's brother Michael has sickle cell anemia, which is an autosomal recessive disease. What is the probability that Ellen's child has a sickle cell anemia allele? Okay, so now we're going to work backwards a little bit. So Ellen's brother has sickle cell disease. She wants to know if she is a carrier for that disease. So how can we work that? So let's take a look at their family here. Okay, so here are their parents, Kate and Brad. Okay, we know Kate and Brad had to be carriers because Michael has the condition. But what we don't know is we don't know if Ellen is a carrier herself. And we want to find out if her future offspring will be a carrier as well. So because we know that Ellen and Michael's parents must be carriers, right? We figured this out because they were able to have Michael, who has sickle cell. So we know that Ellen is not affected, so she can't carry that SS genotype. However, there is a chance that she's a carrier. So what's left here is there's a 2 out of 3 chance that she herself is a carrier for sickle cell disease. So that means that there is a 50% chance that her child is going to have that sickle cell allele herself. So then the overall chance is then 2/3 times 1/2, which is 1/3. Don't get too caught up in this. This is just an example of what we can do with pedigrees. Knowing the trait and where the trait is in the generation, we can figure out the likelihood of potential offspring having these genetic conditions. Now, again, this kind of predates genetic testing. So in the past, if there was a trait in your family, you would sit down with a geneticist and you would create this large pedigree And you would do all these things trying to figure out what the chances were that your offspring would have a particular condition. Now we don't have to do that. We can do a very simple blood test, and that very simple blood test will tell us whether we are carriers for these conditions or not. So again, pedigrees are still important, but in the age of genetic testing, they become a little less important. Okay, so let's compare autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive inheritance patterns as we wrap things up. Are both males and females affected? Yes, because again, these are affecting autosomes and not our sex chromosomes. Can males and females both transmit the trait? Again, yes, because they're on autosomes. Does the trait skip generations? No, in an autosomal dominant. It cannot skip a generation. Yes, in the case of an autosomal recessive. Does at least one parent have to be affected? Again, yes, in the case of an autosomal dominant, and no in the case of an autosomal recessive. You can have generations that do not have this trait in an autosomal recessive pattern, and then it appears. Okay, so important terms and concepts.